of State Policy and Legal Affairs here at SchoolHouse Connection, and I'm joined by my colleague, Patricia Julianelle, who is our Senior Strategist of Legal Affairs and State Policy at SchoolHouse Connection. We are so happy to have you here at our May Community of Practice session. For those who are returning from our March session, we're so happy to have you back. And then for those where this is your first time, welcome. Our state policy focused community of practice is titled Building Teams for Change. And within this community of practice, we are excited to have stakeholders from all walks of life that impact homeless children and youth, and can be able to, can use these sessions as moments to better sharpen their skills and better understand resources that are available to them to help the students that they're working with, either as a homeless service provider, an advocate, an attorney, an educator, school administrator, and so forth. So I am going to drop two things in the chat. The first is a link to our Community of Practice Facebook group, where we will share articles and any resources that folks think would be valuable to other COP members. We ask that you share those there, and so that we can really strengthen our relationship building for this session. So the first link is the Community of Practice Facebook group, and the second link that I'm going to share is our virtual whiteboard. So at our first session in March, we just created this Google document, so you'll be able to sign in and see others who have attended the previous session, as well as those who are attending the session with you. And then there is a quick icebreaker question that you can answer as we get started. All right. I'll give you all a moment to do that. And while you all are signing in, Patricia, would you like to give an overview and a brief introduction for some folks of the ARP funds?
Sure, I'll be glad to. And we could talk for a couple of hours just about that, but I will be brief because that's not the main purpose of our gathering today. But we figured a lot of people might have questions about the American Rescue Plan Act funds that are specifically targeted to students experiencing homelessness. So first, big picture comment, of course, there's billions and billions of dollars in the American Rescue Plan Act, including money that's going for a program called ESSER, which is elementary and secondary education relief funds. There also are around $55 billion going to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for affordable housing and also for homeless assistance services. So there's a lot in ARP that should be serving youth experiencing homelessness, even though it's not specifically targeted to them. So that's the big picture, but the specific ARP funds that are dedicated for children and youth experiencing homelessness in schools, it's $800 million. That money is going out in two batches. About 200 million has already gone out to states. So that goes to state departments of education, specifically to the office of the McKinney-Vento State Coordinator. And that office can retain up to 25% at the state level for state level activities and must give the remaining 75 or more percent out to local educational agencies. And this first batch has to go out to LEAs on a competitive basis. So not every LEA is going to see money from this first batch of funds, probably. The second batch of funds, which will be the remaining 600 million, that will go out later this summer or early fall. Again, that will go out to state educational agencies through the Office of the State Coordinator of Homeless Education, but it will go out to local educational agencies based on a formula. So more LEAs probably will see some of that 600 million coming out in the late summer, fall. Then we'll see this first batch of money that's available now. I am going to pop into the chat box a link to where you can get a lot more detailed information about exactly how much money your state is getting, exactly what it can be used for at the state level, and exactly what it can be used for at the local level. the Department of Education put out some brief guidance on that, and we've got some information about it on our website. So for those of you who are interested in advocating for great uses for that funds, you might want to be in touch with your state coordinator if you work at the state level. If you work more at the local level, you might want to be in touch with your McKinney-Vento liaison. If you are a state coordinator or McKinney-Vento liaison, definitely feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or if there's anything we can do to support you on that. One thing just quickly to note, if you have been working in the McKinney-Vento education world for a while, you're probably familiar with what those funds can and cannot be used for. These ARP funds that are coming out have some broader uses. So for example, they can be used to pay for a short-term stay in a motel or other kind of very short-term housing options, emergency basically for a night or a few nights for a family or a youth. There's also a real strong encouragement, not a requirement, but an encouragement from the Department of Education to look at contracting with community-based organizations to provide wraparound services and other services that students might need. So that could include a variety of things. I mean, as broad as you can think of the word wraparound being, all the different kinds of services that can help youth to attend school and to succeed in school. So you know, things like service navigation, connecting them to resources in the community, providing them with mentorship, with tutoring. It could mean, like I said, very short-term housing, could mean legal services. It could mean a lot of different things. So again, take a look at our link there. If you want more information about those funds or get in touch with your own state coordinator or your own local McKinney-Vento liaison and ask them, on the local level, first of all, are they getting any of that funds? And second of all, you know, is there anything that a community agency or advocate might be able to do to help support the best use of those funds? You're welcome to type any questions that you might have into the chat, and I will do my best to answer them with the information that we have available. And we also have a webinar that we did just last Monday, and I'll look up a link for that right now and post that into the chat too. So if you want even more information, you can feel free to listen to that webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Patricia. And for those who are just joining us, welcome to SchoolHouse Connection's May Community of Practice session. In the chat, you will see 3 links. The last link is from Patricia. That is an overview of ARP funds that she's referenced. The first link is an opportunity to join our Community of Practice Facebook group. And the second link is a virtual whiteboard. So we would love for you all to just kind of sign in, say where you're from, and answer that, that prompt there that's listed in the virtual whiteboard. And before we dive into our presentations and discussions for today, I would love if folks could take about 2 minutes and answer the following 2 questions. What are the ways in which you use data in your work? And what would you like to give to today's session? And what would you like to take? All right, I see that Carol has shared that they use their data to help with budget planning. Are there other folks that want to share? I'll repeat the questions. how you use your data in your work, and what is something that you would like to give to today's session, and what is something that you would like to receive. Okay, so as everyone's commenting in the chat, I am going to go ahead and introduce our first speakers. At this session of Schoolhouse Connections Community of Practice, we're discussing data, advocacy, and the needs of special populations. And we have speakers from the Center for American Progress, Texas Appleseed, and the Montana Legislative Services Division that we're going to hear from. And then we also ask that as you have questions, please feel free to pop those in the chat for the speakers, but there will be a Q&A portion after each presenter's presentation. So first up, we have Jaboa Lake, who is a senior policy analyst for from poverty to prosperity at the Center for American Progress. And we also have Lisette Partlow, who is the Senior Director of K-12 Strategic Initiatives from the Center for American Progress. They are going to answer questions around best practices in accessing data and then in using data and advocacy for marginalized populations. So give me 1 second and I'll be able to upload the PowerPoint, and then Jaboa and Lisette, you can go ahead and get started.
As the PowerPoint is getting uploaded, I want to do a sound check. Am I coming across okay? Okay, just let me know if there's any echoing. I've had some issues with audio the last couple days, so please let me know if they emerge at all. But yeah, good morning or good afternoon to wherever everybody is. I really appreciate you all having CAP here to talk about the way that we approach using data in the type of policy making we do. My name is Jaboa Lake and my pronouns are she and her, and I'll leave it to my colleague to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Lisette Partlow, and I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior director at the Center for American Progress, and I work in the K-12 team.
Okay, next slide. So just to give you a little bit of background on the Center for American Progress, or CAP, there are over 24 policy teams. So we come from two different teams here, but we have over 24. It's a national organization, and we work really deeply in coalitions and collaborative partners on the ground, at the federal level, at the state and local levels, just depending on what kind of work we're doing. But a lot of the work through CAP as an organization is working with federal, state, and local lawmakers to impact policy. For my team, we impact policy that's surrounding poverty, that's seen around K through 12 education. And for the poverty team, some of the issues that we've been focusing on specifically the last while now is around homelessness and housing, criminalization of poverty, modernizing the safety net, things like tax credits, SNAP, and family nutrition. So I'm sure all things that you all are really attuned to and care a lot about. And I'll leave it to Lisette to describe her team a little bit more.
Sure. So our team, as I said earlier, we work on K-12 education, and sort of the overarching premise of or goal of the work that we do is a quality education for every child. And I've listed some of the bullets below that, some of the aspects of our work or the priorities that we've developed to get us to that point. I have not focused a lot on issues around homelessness and education, but I'm here in a supporting role. Jaboa is very much the expert on housing and homelessness at the Center for American Progress, but hoping to be able to answer questions that you might have that kind of interact with K-12 education more deeply. Thanks, Jaboa.
Of course. Next slide. So one of the things that Tamara asked us to talk a little bit about are what kinds of things stakeholders such as people like you are asking for. And I want to come at this with the lens that within my role at CAP, a lot of the stakeholders that are reaching out to me around guidance around policy, the use of data, how to form a narrative around next steps, especially within the COVID recovery framework. We get asked by states and localities, local offices, lawmakers. We also get reached out to by other nonprofits, direct service providers, places like schools, shelters, others that are looking for guidance both to understand what's going on at the federal level and how it impacts their work, but also at the federal level and how we can guide different policy and program development that's going to be as equitable as we can make it. So a lot of times when we're thinking about the type of data that we want to bring forward, we're often asked, what is the most current picture of what's going on right now, which means that stakeholders are looking for data that is as local as possible and as timely as possible. And I'm sure we all know that getting local and timely data is extremely difficult if it exists at all. So we also do a lot of just advocating for data collection. For example, there's no federal, data collection around evictions in the United States. And this poses a huge problem for housing advocacy. So we do talk a lot about like what isn't there, while we also talk about what is there. And we pull from places like recent surveys and polling both internally at CAP, where we do our own data collection. We'll ask specific groups of people how they're faring. We'll also do just general polling. We did the LGBTQ advocacy team recently did a survey last year on 1,500 LGBTQ people on a broad range of things such as access to nutrition, access to shelters, things like that. So we're really going to people that are directly impacted by the types of policies we push for. And we also really want to offer a really critical examination of pre-COVID data. In this moment, we're asked a lot about how to move forward. How do we provide a path forward that's equitable and includes all people who need assistance? But because there's so little data of what's actually going on during COVID and how people are faring, we do offer really critical examination of pre-COVID data and talk about how that still can be used to advocate for the things that you want to advocate for now. We're also asked to track different policies, and a lot of that was about what's going on right now, but we do a lot of deep dives, so understanding the deep context and history and the impacts on equitable outcomes. And I put a couple of examples of the types of data sources that we draw from. So these can be community generated data sources. So we can think about places like the Black Census Project out of the Black Futures Lab, the Research Justice Lab from the Coalition of Communities of Color that I worked with deeply out in Portland, Oregon before my years at CAP. But we also look for state and local data and federal data from the census agencies, and then more recently the Household Pulse Survey, which emerged out of the pandemic and gives us really good current snapshots on what's going on right now. Next slide. So there's a lot of text on this slide, but I wanted to include this so you all can refer back to it. But I thought about including some data that we have collected or have been using to analyze that is helpful for you all, but I thought it'd be really helpful to talk about the way that we approach the way that we interact with data and use that to advocate for the types of policies that we're advocating for. And I kind of made a couple of different buckets that I thought might be helpful here. So one of them is really about, and we hear this a lot, centering racial, gender, LGBTQ, and disability equity, especially in an equitable recovery right now. And that means undoing past harms and current harms. When we're talking about centering equity, a lot of times it's done as an aside, but we really mean centering it, making sure that all of the policies that we're pushing for are race conscious, gender conscious, queer conscious, disability conscious, so that it's not something that's just thought of as an aside or an addition to a policy. We also really, lead with listening and leading with community voices. And this is around, making sure that every step of the policy process and the recommendation process, we are including what is going on in the community and people who are directly impacted. And this can be things from before we release a policy brief, making sure that that policy brief is being reviewed by people who are the most impacted. For example, early on in COVID, we released some recommendations on including people experiencing homelessness in federal relief packages. And that piece was reviewed by people currently experiencing homelessness. It was reviewed by advocates who work with women fleeing domestic violence. And those are the types of ways that we make sure that community is included in the process. But we also need to recognize our own personal positionality. So when looking at data, we're all coming at it using our own lenses to interpret it. And sometimes that means things that are very close to us. So for myself, personally, I really care about homelessness because I was homeless as a child. I was in the foster care system. These are things that are really close to me, but I have to be conscious that my experience isn't the only experience and it's not universal. So making sure that we're including community voices means that we're going to be including as many stories as possible to add those stories to what numbers are trying to tell us. We also focus on uplifting. So this is making sure that we are not overstepping as an organization. Center for American Progress can tend to overstep in certain policy areas. So working in coalitions, working with partnerships with the organizations and the people who have been leading these efforts for decades, who have been doing deep work in different issues, and making sure that we are not just saying, well, we think this should happen, but really consulting the people who are the experts in different areas, and making sure that we're not just pulling things out of anywhere to make recommendations because it's hot in the moment. This means, going and looking at community-led efforts that aren't often recognized at the federal policy level. So what has happened in the past? What are some new community efforts around mutual aid and, community caretaking? What do people's budgets look like? So what are the city budgets that are developed by grassroots groups looking like? What do community models of safety and wellness look like? All of those types of things. And then lastly, I'll talk about, and I kind of mentioned this beforehand, but really looking at data with a critical lens. So this means, understanding where the data came from, what is asked, and what and who is missing. So when we look at data, it's really easy to just be like, these are the numbers, these are the disparities, and that can tell a story in itself. But it is important when we're drawing from data sources to understand a little bit more deeply about where it came from and what is there. For example, there was a recent policy report that I reviewed for a colleague that was looking at the racially disparate impacts of adverse childhood experiences. And one thing that they hadn't quite noticed was that the data that they were looking at that was looking at adverse childhood experiences by things like age and race and gender of children, their method of collecting data was through door knocking and door to door. And I kind of had to point out, well, this leaves out a huge group of people. Children experiencing homelessness may not be present in that, data collection method. So, and we know that experiencing homelessness is part of the ACEs. So we're already missing out on a huge chunk of children whose voices and stories aren't being heard in this data set, and who we know are disproportionately children of color, because children of color are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. So things like that around really understanding what data comes from so that we can use it to advocate as best as possible. And again, this means connecting past, present, and future, and taking a really multi-generational approach to interpreting data and analysis. So what's happening to a child now is a reflection of what happened to their parents, and what happened to their aunts and uncles, and what happened to their grandparents, and what may happen to their children or their nibblings or anybody like that. So it's not just a snapshot about one person's life, because we don't all exist in these silos like that. And then also recognizing that storytelling in itself is data. I saw in the chat that a lot of people, talk about using data to complement storytelling or testimony. And I think that that is essential. We need both sides. We need numbers and we need stories. But we also need to recognize storytelling as data. And I see this, because a lot of times when we're looking at data, we're looking at disparity. So children of color are experiencing more homelessness. And I think that's important to recognize for so many reasons. But at the same time, any child experiencing homelessness is a bad thing. So, with or without the numbers, if there's one person who is experiencing hardship, that is something that we need to focus on and build policy towards eradicating. The next slide. And I know I'm talking fast, but I'm trying to be brief. I talk too much, I swear. So we're going to give just a couple of examples in the work at CAP specifically that has used this lens. So within the decennial census, I wrote a report with the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality and the National LGBTQ Task Force last year, really critically looking at how the 2020 census was, quite frankly, a mess, and how the miscounts and undercounts of people experiencing homelessness are going to directly impact federal funding for life-saving programs. So this wasn't just a look at, what are the numbers saying? What might the numbers say based on the methods that they're using? But really looking at how these, when we're looking at things like the census, it isn't just like how many people are experiencing homelessness, which is an undercount already, or what's going on. It's really looking about how does that impact, advocacy for more granting towards this program? How does that impact advocacy towards more granting for things like housing investments, education, the Violence Against Women Act, and sheltering and providing assistance for families who are fleeing violence, things like that. And then another project around really critically looking at data and how it's collected that I'm working on currently and don't have anything published on, but doing a deep dive is it's HUD's point in time count, which was released. The first numbers were released in March of this year. And it's showing that things like, homelessness is on the rise. What the point in time count is, if you're not familiar, is at the last week of every January of every year, there is a one day where all people experiencing homelessness are supposed to be counted. It's supposed to give a snapshot about how many people are experiencing homelessness on any given night. But what this doesn't do is it doesn't count people who are doubled up. It doesn't count people who are sleeping, in their friends' garages or their friends' couches. It doesn't count people who are rural and unsheltered and living out in forests or things like that. So there's a huge undercount. And the problem with looking at data like this that is being undercounted and isn't counting huge swaths of people is that, we look at grants and agencies who define homelessness much more broadly than the counting mechanisms are themselves. So what we're doing is then assigning a number that we know is too low to a point of a federal program or a granting program, and kind of setting it up to fail because we know that it's not going to be an adequate number. So when we're talking about using data in these ways, we really have to think about where it's coming from, what it's actually saying, and especially who's missing from it so that we can use it best. And then Patricia, talked about the ARP fundings, and I'm going to leave it to Lizette to talk a little bit more about how enumerating homelessness can impact ARP funds.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, as I'm sure you're all aware, and I think a lot of organization groups like those of you on the call have been feeding into national organizations, and a lot of the folks here at the national and federal level have been trying to advocate for getting school districts to really assertively and proactively reach out to families, because if they have a count of students experiencing either housing insecurity or homelessness from prior to the pandemic, the likelihood that that status has changed for a lot of students is probably pretty high. And so making sure that access to the ARP funding, students are getting access to the ARP funding who need it.
Yeah, and Lizette can answer a lot more questions on that than I can. But, you know, I say all this in very quickly to kind of just introduce the way that we are approaching data, what we're thinking about, especially the gaps we're trying to fill, that data sometimes doesn't exist or it miscounts people or completely ignores people, and what that means for advocacy and how we bring that to the table when we're invited to talk about developing policies and programs and how to best you know, advocate for people who are often not advocated for in certain spaces. Next slide. So that's all I had prepared, but I'm very open to answering any questions or opening up for any discussions from anybody given time, and I'll leave it to Tamara to facilitate any time, so I know we've gone over quite a bit.
Okay, thank you so much, Jaboa and Lizette. Let's see, Patricia, do you mind monitoring the chat to see if there are any incoming questions?
Sure, there are no questions at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Tamara, would you let Brett in? She may show up as Jamie Sauer.
Sure. Yeah, I see some folks have been waiting. Okay, yeah. Okay, well, if you have questions I believe Jaboa and Lizette are staying with us until the end of our session. So if you have questions that come to mind during the rest of the session, feel free to pop them in the chat. Okay. So I want to introduce Gabriella and Brett, but I want to make sure that both of you all have been able to join. Brett, are you on?
It looks like she's connecting to audio still.
Yeah.
There we go. There, now she should be on.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So thank you again to Jaboa and Lizette from the Center for American Progress. Next, we have Brett Murfish, who is the Director of Youth Justice at Texas Appleseed, as well as Gabriella McDonald, who is the Pro Bono and New Projects Director at Texas Appleseed. They're going to answer the same questions as Jaboa and Lizette had, but they're just going to be offering their own perspective, given that they have a state focus, and they're also working in a state that is incredibly different than some of the happenings in like the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. So Brett and Gabriella, take it away.
Great, thank you so much for having us. Like you said, my name is Gabriella McDonald, and I'm the Pro Bono New Projects Director at Texas Appleseed. For those of you who don't know, Texas Appleseed is a state-based organization that works to make social and economic change on a wide variety of issues, from fair housing to fair financial services, ending the school to prison pipeline, juvenile justice issues, criminal justice issues. And so we actually came to homelessness work based off of some of our other intersecting work, and especially during our truancy work in 2015, where Texas was one of 2 states that criminalized truancy, where youth could actually either end up paying a fine, and if they couldn't pay the fine by the time they turned 17, they could spend time in jail to work off their fine. And we were sitting in court and we kept seeing youth after youth talking about their experiences and why they were missing class. And we were like, these youth are experiencing homelessness. At the same time, we had a law firm come to us and say, we've been working on this homeless youth handbook in other states. We'd like to make one for Texas, but we need an organization on the ground who understands Texas law. And so we started creating a homeless youth handbook that let youth know what their rights and responsibilities were based on Texas law. And then we also started working on policy work. And one of the ways that Appleseed really does that is through data and really becoming deeply familiar with an issue before we start to make policy recommendations. And if you go to the next slide, Tamara, we actually worked on this report called Young, Alone, and Homeless in the Lone Star State. And the sources of data, we started to do some research and talk to people, and Patricia was one of those people, thankfully, who provided us with a lot of guidance in the beginning as we were just getting to know this issue. And so these are the organizations and the places we started to go to start to pull state-based data on youth homelessness in Texas. And so the Texas Education Agency, the Foster Care Agency, which is the Department of Family and Protective Services here, our Juvenile Justice Agency, which is the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. You will see that we partnered with T-Noise, which is the Texas Network of Youth Services, because they actually were already doing something for the legislature, but I will say they couldn't, in their report, they couldn't say all of the things that we could say as somebody who wasn't funded by the government, by the legislature. And so they were really excited to be able to partner with us to talk about those things that they couldn't say based on what the legislature had asked them to do. We also talked to law enforcement, local mental health authorities, of course, homeless youth themselves, and service providers. And these really provided some interesting and unique data points because of the fact that in Texas, there is no specific agency that deals with youth homelessness. And that's true for most states, right? And so we had to kind of cobble together data from different places to really understand the larger picture of what it was like to be young and homeless in Texas. And if you'll go to the next slide. And I will talk, some of the best practices that we found and some of the kind of challenges that you run into talking through this. And so I'll go through the first three and then I'll turn it over to Brett to go through the next three. But the first one is using comprehensive and current data sources, which seems obvious, but it's not always obvious where to find that. You would think the state agency has the most recent data, but oftentimes, for example, the Texas Education Agency had data, but it was super old. And so sometimes we would need to go to the local education agency, whatever local school districts had data and was willing to share it with us to kind of supplement and provide a more recent picture. So we would use the statewide data to talk about statewide issues, but then we would also talk about, in more recent years, these are some of the trends we're seeing on the local level. And so we often had people in their local areas contact us and say, hey, do you have data for this place or that place? And even if we didn't have the data, we could then share where they could probably go get it to make some change and figure out what the picture looked like in their area. The other thing is our Department of Family and Protective Services is being sued or was being sued at the time we were writing the report. So they were very hesitant to give us data in the first place. So we had to kind of tug and pull teeth and use all of the publicly available data there. But then if we could pull from other sources, again, that were more recent, that were more comprehensive, we tried to do that as well to kind of supplement the report. Additionally, we want to ensure that data is broken out in subpopulations. Of course, the last presenters just talked about, centering these populations, but it's really important also in Texas not to just center, race and gender and LGBTQ people, but we're talking often about location and rural and urban areas. And the reason we bring that out in Texas is because it's such a huge deal for us here. When we're actually trying to persuade legislators who are in rural areas and they say, we don't have any homeless youth in our area. And we're like, no, you're wrong. Let me tell you why you're wrong and where the data is and what information you need to know about that. And so talking about disaggregate data, it's just really, really important because it reveals such interesting trends in your area. And this may not be true for, every area, but in Texas, when we were looking at runaway data and youth experiencing homelessness because they were running away from a certain situation, either the foster care system or their own homes, we saw a lot of Latinas who were dealing with this issue. Of course, Black students were overrepresented, both male and female, but we saw a lot of Latinas severely overrepresented in our runaway data. And so we were wondering, is that something we need to look at specifically? Is there some way we need to address that? Is that also location-based? And that helped reveal additional questions we needed to answer based on that. The other thing I will say, and the last thing I'll talk about before I turn it over to Brett, is, qualitative data really enhances that quantitative data, as the last presenter said as well. It is so important to be able to tell the stories and understand what the data is actually saying. And we were able to interview, I want to say about 113 youth across the state for this report, in addition to interviewing homeless liaisons, homeless service providers, law enforcement, medical providers to provide some real color and understanding for that. And one of the things that really helped us understand is, for example, also dealing with runaway numbers, for example. Harris County, which incorporates Houston, has a ton of youth, has the most youth in the state. But we were seeing way more runaway numbers in Dallas County. And we learned through talking through their law enforcement agencies that Dallas County actually had a specific program that was looking for high-risk victims, and which includes human trafficking. And that may have been why Dallas County's numbers were so much larger than Harris County's numbers, even though Harris County has more kids in Houston. And so those were the types of things that were really important to understand. The other one that sticks with me so much is through talking to youth and through talking to providers, we really saw that foster youth had a harder time dealing with homelessness once they aged out of care than youth who had just experienced homelessness, because of the way that foster youth are provided with everything. They're told to do everything, when to do it, how to do it, and they don't have to fight and fend and understand the systems as hard as youth who are experiencing homelessness all the time, because there is not necessarily always that guidance. And so it was really interesting to talk to youth who had experienced both and how they managed after they aged out of care and what that meant for the types of services and supports they would need once they left. And that made a big difference in our recommendations for those populations. Brett, I will turn it over to you to talk about the next three.
Okay, sorry that I missed the beginning of the presentation. I was stuck in the waiting room. Thanks, Gabriella. I actually came on after Gabriella had already completed the report. And so then I kind of picked up the torch and have been working towards making changes based on the data that was in the report. So really, two of my main points have to do with like how to take data and use it for advocacy in a way that people can understand. So I don't know if you could go to the next slide where we talk about humanizing the data. So really, we had all this stuff that told us that homeless students, were getting suspended from school at higher rates. And we knew that, that included out of school suspension. So where do homeless students go when it's out of school suspension? They go to the street. Sometimes they can go to shelters. Sometimes the shelters close during that school hours. And so we decided to make it so that any student experiencing homelessness couldn't experience out of school suspension. And we know that they also, have, and I'm probably telling you things you already know, but that in school suspension also is, they're suspended for in school suspension at a higher rate. And so through the qualitative interviews, we had met Lyric, who actually works for T-Noise. And she had a story about getting out of school suspension. And so we said, okay, this is perfect. We'll have Lyric's story. She'll humanize it. She was willing to share her story publicly and put her face on things. And, with this, I'm sure this could be a whole nother PowerPoint, like how do you give the storyteller or the person who owns the story ownership? And so we had like a pretty, I would say, intricate process where we would go back and forth and she would make changes and we would say, okay, well, this isn't clear, so that she was comfortable and she felt like it was her voice. And then I know it's kind of small, but we used her story to then pull people in, pull legislators in, and then sort of show the statistics behind it, which were on the back. And I think that, we always need that. I wish that we could take data to legislators and the people we're trying to convince, and sorry, we use this at the state legislature, and that the data would be enough, but we find that it really isn't. And that if you get, someone like Lyric to show up and testify, that really makes the data feel more real to people. It pulls them in and then they want to do something. And we actually passed this bill last session in Texas, and it was really exciting. So that's kind of humanizing the data. That was Gabrielle and my way of saying that. And then I think what the data means. So I think it's really easy to look at a stat, and we all do this in our lives. Oh, well, it must be this way because of X. So like, for instance, we're a big state and we have a lot of diversity within our state. And you could look at South Texas, which is where we have like, high concentration of Latino population. And you could say, oh, they don't really have much homelessness in the Rio Grande Valley. Great, let's move on. And that's really not the case. And so, you kind of have to dig underneath that and ask questions. And, what we found is that those numbers are really underestimating the homelessness there because of various reasons. I think like cultural, economic, socioeconomic. A lot of times you have families doubled up there. And so they count as homeless under McKinney-Vento, but they don't actually identify that way. And sometimes even the school isn't identifying them that way. And so it's important to look beyond the numbers and make sure that the data you have is actually accurate. And also that you can explain, you know, maybe you did have higher numbers in Rio Grande Valley and you could explain why that is. And then I think the next one is kind of what we were saying about humanizing the infographics. So this is like an example I think you can see on the other side, but we probably could have given another example of how we use infographics to make data more digestible, basically. And so, you know, we kind of spend a lot of time, it's like, I laugh because Gabrielle and I didn't go to like law and policy school. And they didn't really, when we went, maybe they teach them now, we didn't learn how to like use like, you know, Adobe or Canva to make data pretty. But like I spend a lot of time like trying to pretend like I did go to school to do that. And so making the data look pretty and make it, you know, so you don't have to read a sentence, you can just look at a picture and get what we're trying to say. And so I think that is really key for us in kind of convincing people that of what we have. The other thing that we have done is something called We Do Exist. So that was the same idea of trying to, you know, I think sometimes we think, okay, we're going to get the data and then we're going to take it. And sometimes we can also influence what the data says. So like with point in time counts, like getting in there earlier and trying to push how that's done. And then you're kind of influencing what the data looks like, and then that helps you. And I'll just talk really briefly and then I'll wrap up about some of the changes we have made and what we're working on right now. So I mentioned the out of school suspension. We also made it so that any fees associated with like driver's licenses or the documents you need for driver's license, the state would cover. To do that, we had to create a fund, basically, where like in Texas, when you go and renew your license, you say like, do you want to give to homeless children and people experiencing homelessness? And so many people said yes, that we have like $1 million in the fund within a year. And so now we're like, great, we're going to try and use that for other things. But to do that, we have to pass a bill every time. So we're trying to pass a bill to make it so that, as many of you know, a lot of times the driver's license itself is an issue, but it's also the driver's education that you need to get the license. And so we're trying to fund driver's ed programs for kids in foster care who have aged out up to a certain age, and then youth experiencing homelessness up to a certain age. Because the money is there, we have a lot of support. So we're kind of doing some legislative fine tuning and praying that it gets through. We've had a really weird session in Texas. And then we're also working to decriminalize runaway in our state. We have a thing where it's kind of funny that some of our bigger counties actually don't detain kids for runaway. In some of our smaller counties, a third of their detentions are for runaway. So we're trying to keep them from using that. They say they need it as a tool. We say they don't, but trying to keep that from being the reason that a child's detained, and looking for other interventions that don't traumatize and criminalize kids. And then our last initiative that has actually gotten way more traction than I thought it would, but it's a good thing, is decriminalizing is like curfew ordinances. So I don't know if everyone else still has those, but we still have them in a lot of cities in Texas. And basically it makes it class misdemeanor to be out after a certain hour. So same idea, that criminalizes kids who are, you know, running away, or I call seeking safety, or homeless people experiencing homelessness. So that's kind of like a brief overview of what we're doing and what we hope to do, and how much we rely on data all the time. I think I would just say that I think data is really important, especially with homeless youth, because they're often overlooked and invisible, and people think that there are no homeless youth. And so you have to have the numbers to convince them that there really are. And I think without that, it's much more difficult. And so it's definitely like a vital and necessary part of any advocacy, but I would say particularly vital for young people experiencing homelessness because of that sort of hurdle of invisibility that we have to, that we face. So I think that's it.
Yeah.
Gabriella, did you have any other thoughts?
The only other thought I had, if you can go to the next slide, is that having that relationship with the schools is so essential with homeless liaisons, because they are the ones that really know the numbers for under 18, and then over 18 with providers is really important for us as advocates working on these issues. So that's it.
Wonderful. Gabriella and Brett, thank you so much for sharing. Let's see. Patricia, are there any?
No, there are no questions in the chat box at this time.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. Gabriella, I did have a question. I'm just wondering if you, you mentioned the different sources that you look to for research purposes. And I'm wondering if you have an idea of like what your organization budgets for subscriptions to those services, or if these are services that are just like free and available.
So it's very much on a case-by-case basis. When we are applying for grants, just for the record, our funding is not from any government source. We do all of our funding for grants, donations, and from fundraising. And when we are creating a budget for a project, we are definitely include the cost of research. Oftentimes our data information and where it's coming from is going to be public information requests. And so if the public information request is going to cost us funds, we will take that into account if we can kind of estimate what that would look like. Oftentimes we're asking for data we've asked for in the past, so we know, how it's kept sometimes. And if we don't know how it's kept, we hope it's kept electronically so that it's low cost. And if it's not kept electronically, then we try and modify the way we ask for the data, or we try to limit the specific things so that we know exactly what we want. Sometimes we just don't know exactly what it is we need, and we just have to kind of talk and have a really good conversation back and forth with the agency to talk about what, how they keep it, and ways that we could possibly limit what the cost might be to actually pull that. But we just include whatever we can. For the homeless youth policy report, we included being able to have gift cards and to supply food to all of the youth when we were interviewing them if they wanted to participate. And so we had to make sure all of that funding was included in the grant that we applied for that supported that work. And so we continue to apply for grants as we're doing our work. And sometimes we don't have the funding for it, and we just have to pull it from our general revenue because it's important to get the data.
Right.
I was just gonna add, like, the whole collecting data is a job in itself. And it's actually why at Appleseed, we ended up hiring someone to just do that, because we were spending so much time like in our sort of like subject area expertise, like writing to agencies, writing to school districts, right, like on and on and on. And it just takes so much time and work. And so now we have someone dedicated to doing that. And I'll also just say that in my juvenile justice hat that I also do, we actually had the agency like pull the rug out from under us and say, oh no, we can't give you any data by county. We can't give you any county this, county that. And so we actually had to go to the legislature and tell them they have to do that, because otherwise in Texas, you're looking at 250 counties. So just a different part of advocating for data sometimes is changing the rules so you can get the data that you want, while also always respecting obviously the privacy of the parties involved. But just thought I'd throw that in. It just never ends. You just have to advocate up and down like throughout the process.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I feel like a number of people on this call can relate to that sentiment. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it makes you want to pull your hair out, but it's worth it. So.
Okay, so our final presenter is Hope Stockwell from the Montana Legislative Services Division. Hope is a research analyst, and I really value Hope sharing with this group because the space that she's coming from is not one of being an advocate, but it's really being a general researcher and having like an objective approach. So I think that's going to be able to add a lot of like value and context to the conversation. We did have Montana State Senator Jen Gross, who's going to be in conversation with Hope today, but unfortunately the senator had a small emergency, so she won't be able to make it. But we do have Hope, who has partnered with Senator Gross, so she can be able to speak to that experience as well.
Certainly. Thanks, Tamara. And would you mind stopping to share your screen?
Sure.
Help me a little bit. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Hope Stockwell. I work for the Montana Legislative Services Division as a nonpartisan research analyst. I've been here 13 years. I'm on the other side of the equation of what you've heard about today. So I work directly with legislative committees. Our legislature meets every other year, and during the interim period when they're not in session, I'm staffing 2 policy committees. One is a natural resources committee and the other is the state tribal relations committee. And that's my nexus with your work today and how I met Patricia last interim. The state tribal relations committee started in 2017 working on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. And as part of the data gathering for that, we were going through Department of Justice data on missing persons. The committee learned that the number of youth, both Native and non-Native, who are reported missing multiple times was troublesome. And so that was our way of stating runaway. Brett was talking about, seeking help, seeking shelter. The term runaway is a little tough, but it is the most immediate thing that comes to mind for legislators when they're talking about this. So 2 sides of that nomenclature coin, but what they learned about as they started digging into the data on youth reported missing multiple times. But Montana has about 1 million people in our population, and between 2013 and 2017, there were 543 youth reported missing 3 or more times in that time period. And one of those youth was reported missing 26 times. And so there are clearly, if you can get that far down into the data, clearly things going on for that kid and these other children. And the committee was interested in learning more about, okay, what are some ways that we can help these youth end this cycle? And they ended up focusing on runaway youth in their work that began in 2019 after that session. And what came out of that become my takeaways for you today. And there are 3 of them. 1, if someone asks you for an idea of what to do, be ready to give them one. 2, when they say, okay, let's go with that, be ready to flesh it out with them into something that can work. And then 3, be ready to sell it once you get to the legislative process in the session. And so we kind of started in March 2020, digging into the background with Heather Denny, our state's homeless education coordinator. This was our last in-person meeting before COVID shut things down. So I have a really vivid memory of Heather's presentation to the committee. And at the end of her presentation, the chair asked her if she had any tangible ideas about what the legislature could do to help these kids. And I had prepped Heather because the chair likes to ask this question of every presenter, and Heather came ready. She had 2 specific ideas. She said, 1, allow runaway youth to stay at homeless shelters without parental consent. And 2, allow them to graduate without meeting a school district's individual credit requirement if it's higher than the state's credit requirement. So give them another path to graduation if they meet the state standard. And so the committee said, all right, let's take a look. And then I spent the next few weeks researching options to give the committee a menu of things they could choose from. I like to equate it to those old choose your own adventure books that I read growing up. Okay, you want to get here? Well, here are 4 doors you can open and see what happens. But Heather helped me flesh them out. She connected me with Patricia. Patricia was ready with information about what other states were doing and had advice on which state laws might be best models based on what our legislators said they would be interested in. And so I looked at those, I summarized them for the committee, and then meshed them into 2 baseline proposals on each of those suggestions Heather made. Heather reviewed them, Patricia reviewed them. They got other stakeholders involved to review them. They brought people to bear that I had no idea existed in our state and organizations. And that was really valuable for me as a research analyst. I spend a lot of time trying to make connections and get legislators to the right information. I'm not necessarily generating the data. Sometimes I am, but often I'm just trying to get people to the right people. And so if you come to talk about a proposal and you can help bring that context and background to me and say, hey, okay, you want to delve into this? You should talk to this person and that person and that person, et cetera. and be ready to help me kind of navigate that world. So Heather and Patricia did that. We spent time hashing through language with the stakeholders. On the graduation piece, I spent a lot of time talking to representatives for school districts and school administrators groups who were concerned about that graduation proposal, but we got it into something that they could work with and live with. So it was really a group effort, lots of time going into hashing it out. And ultimately, the committee signed off on 3 concepts. 2 were related to the shelter and housing, and then 1 was related to the graduation requirement. And they took those 3 to the 2021 legislature. Senator Gross sponsored 2 of them. I'm sorry she can't be with us today, but I'll just talk to you more generically. She really would have the backstory on how she worked with some Republican legislators. She's a Democrat. We have a Republican controlled legislature, how she worked with them to cross party lines and subgroups and speak to people's heart. Because at heart, you know, she said to me, people want to help runaway youth. It's just a matter of the finer points and details and philosophy, and see if we can get them there with a level of comfort with other strongly held beliefs they may have in some cases. So when you get to the legislative arena, as we were in January, that's where you have to be ready to sell it. And I would say, from my perspective, the best thing you can do is lay the groundwork before you get there. Work with your policy committees, depending on how your legislature is set up. Do the legwork, start to get to know your legislators months in advance. You can start within your individual legislative districts, who represents you, and then you can look at specific committees that fit the topics that you work in. And maybe you can develop relationships with all the legislators on those committees, or maybe you just focus on a few key people from each committee, the leadership of the committee, specific people on the committee who you know have a real heart for what you're talking about. Or maybe they're most adept at navigating the political waters on certain topics, and build relationships with them. You need to work into that level of trust, so that they know they can rely on you when they're in the heat of the session and say they need an answer to something or help formulating an argument. They can turn to you and know that you're going to have good information for them at hand. And then as you do that, get to know the legislators, how they prefer to communicate. Is it a phone call, email, text, something else? And how do they like to learn? Brett really was talking about data visualization, and that's something we try and refine here in my job over and over and over again. And it's hard. We're dealing with different generations of legislators, so it's not cookie cutter, one size fits all. Some of the younger ones like other things than the older ones like. But that visual, being able to give them something really good visually that they can quickly look at and comprehend your data is worth gold. So that's a lot. I know Brett said she spends a lot of time doing it, but it's worth its weight in gold. I would say review your legislative website, get to know it, sign up for electronic notifications if you can from the committees that you're interested in. And then if you get to a committee meeting and you're going to testify, be prepared. Introduce yourself and who you represent, limit your remarks, and then it's always good. You can turn in a written statement here, and I would presume that most legislatures are that way. But if you have the written statement, don't just read from it. Give an oral presentation, a summary. There's nothing worse than seeing somebody with their head stuck in their paper when they're making their presentation. Bring handouts if you need to provide that data visualization, whatever it is, to give them more background, more things they can chew on. And then know any rules of the decorum that the legislature or the committee may have. In Montana, every time you speak, you have to go through the chair. That's a very specific thing. I won't talk about it now, but just know how your committee operates, how the chair likes to run it, so that you're not stepping out of boundaries and getting into an awkward situation. Testifying, it's not your time to ask questions. So know that sometimes newbies don't realize that, and they want to engage in a conversation during the committee time to testify, and that's just not what that's for. And that can be a little awkward if you make that faux pas, so know that ahead of time. And then always turn off your cell phone. Do not let it ring in the middle of the committee. Switching gears and speaking back to the data piece, the other thing that we really had going on this last interim related to runaway youth was an interest by Heather to get the new YRBS question about runaway youth into Montana's survey. And there was some internal struggle with that. And the committee was interested in getting the question answered because as I can't remember if it was Gabriella or Brett, I think it was Gabriella said, you know, we're hoping we're going to reveal questions that we need to ask or get answers to. And the committee really felt that runaway youth data from the YRBS would be helpful in Montana to understand some of the subtleties and nuance of what's going on in these kids' lives. And so they were able to work with the Office of Public Instruction and get that question included. So they were really excited about where that might take us in the future as we continue to look at this question, because the 3 pieces of legislation, 2 of them passed, 1 of them did not. But even with 2, if they had all 3 passed, there's still tons of work to do. And so this will be an ever evolving topic. And so that is my story in a nutshell. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have. And I'm sorry, yes, YRBS is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that the states carry out for the feds. Sorry about that, Patricia, thanks.
Thank you so much, Hope. Do we have any questions for Hope right now?
We don't have any in the chat box right now, but I do have a question, if that's okay. And I'm wondering, Hope, from your position inside a state legislature, have you had the experience of a time when a legislator changed his or her opinion? And if so, what persuaded them? What changed their opinion on a bill or on an issue?
The one that most immediately comes to mind, and I would say absolutely yes. I mean, ideally, that's the whole point of the legislative process, is that people are listening and, you know, getting give and take and back and forth. And to me, it always comes down to who they know who is impacted. So telling Lyric's story, that's one of the most powerful things you can do, making it real for them. I think particularly of one of our older Republican legislators. It was his last session this go around, but a couple of sessions ago, we had some, and we've had so many bills in this arena. I can't remember exactly what the details of this one were, but it was related to LGBTQ. And he is not someone based on politics you would expect to stand up and speak publicly in support of this bill on the floor, but he did, because his daughter fits in that community, as I recall. I think it was his daughter, not his niece. And for him, that's what it came down to, is if you're going to paint somebody with political stripes, he probably didn't fit as a supporter of this bill, but you know, it really impacted him personally. He had a personal story, and that's why he voted the way he did. And he is someone who is influential with his political stripes, and they came over and supported the bill, and the bill passed. I think it was a non-discrimination bill, as I'm recalling. I'm sorry, I'm a little fuzzy, but those personal stories are what get you there, Patricia.
Thanks, Hope. We don't have any other questions in the chat right now, but people can still feel free to type them in because we have some time left in our meeting.
We do. And as folks are thinking about possible questions for the presenters, I actually have questions for the group. I have 3 questions. The first question is, what data sources are available to you for your work? Whether that's at a specific school, a district, a state agency, a law firm, or a nonprofit. Our goal is to help folks to begin brainstorming and identifying the resources that are available to them that can help in this work and how they can best access and use those resources. I'll also type the question in the chat.
I will say one data source that we probably could have mined more was actually asking providers for the data that they keep. Because, you know, it's another source of like local data and understanding general places. Because oftentimes we would have, you know, the statewide data or national data about this population, but having specific data about the homeless shelter or the, you know, service provider in a certain legislator's area really made a huge difference for that legislator and what they wanted to do.
I would second that, Gabriella. I typed into the chat the Federal Department of Education data that I use like all the time, almost on a daily basis, but definitely in working in particular states, asking community members what data they have, what's available, and also getting back to what everyone has talked about, those personal stories and getting those particularly sometimes targeted to a particular part of the state that is constituents of a particular legislator that we might be trying to influence, or just even if it's not a particular legislator, but just having that local, really grounded information.
Thanks for sharing, Patricia and Gabriella. Let's see. Do we have any other responses?
HMIS data, Homeless Management Information System data, was something that Rebecca shared. And I just put in the link to the Voices of Youth Count study. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, that was run by Chapin Hall out of Illinois, but it's national. It originally came out, I want to say in 2017, if not late 2016, and then they've been building on it ever since. So again, that's national data rather than state or local, but it's really helpful and powerful in terms, and it also does talk a lot about the different kinds of disproportionality, disproportionality for Black youth, LGBTQ youth for sure, Latino youth. So it's pretty interesting data.
All right, so the second question is, how can you use data to better advocate for and with students who fall into special populations?
So I will say, sometimes we are not able to get change on the state level immediately. And one of the ways we will sometimes get around that is to start to get certain municipalities to change the way that they operate. And if we can change the way that individual school districts, especially if they're large school districts in rural areas or large school districts, just generally Houston, Dallas, El Paso, get them to make some changes and see that it works for those populations, we can then get state level change on that work. So I think sometimes that's just a way we have to get around when there's not the will at the state level, is to get a bunch of localities to make the change, to start to see what the data actually looks like. And that's one of the ways we actually worked some of our curfew work, and maybe why we see curfews changing or the potential for the curfew law passing this session is because in Austin, we were able to get rid of our curfew law there. And we've seen a 21% decrease in youth victimization, according to, and the police chief was able to give us that data. And so that was really something that was interesting to me, and that's something that fits in this category, I think.
This is Jabo again. One thing that I did when I was working in Oregon before I was at the Center for American Progress, when we were trying to use data to advocate for communities of color specifically, and often parents, was, and this applies to youth too, is not just using storytelling to complement data, but generating policy directly from it by doing data checks. So having focus groups where we present the data to the people who were asked the questions and ask them, like, what does this mean to you? Is it reflective of your experiences? What's missing here? So really going, when we do have data, especially if it's collected at the federal, state, or local levels, and really doesn't involve people most impacted in the collection of that data, bringing it back to the community and saying, what does this mean for you? How can we move on, move forward with this? What policies can you see to help alleviate these problems, and see if it's actually a reflection of what they're going through?
That's a great idea, Jabo. It's like another layer of checks and balances to make sure that there is equity in the collection process.
I would chime in just to build on what Gabriella was saying, and I think Hope is referencing this too. about, if you can convince some of your larger municipalities to try something, then you can hopefully get the state to follow suit. And that's something that I know we've done state to state. So for example, if you're trying to put forth the policy in Montana and you can show that a very similar policy passed in Wyoming, and the world didn't end and everybody didn't kind of lose track of things, it worked just fine, then that can help legislators feel more comfortable trying it in their state. So if it's a state maybe with a similar demographics or similar political persuasions, to use that as influential. And I definitely have said in many red states, well, look what Texas did. I've used Gabriella's and Brett's work to try to convince other states to follow suit. And I will certainly be using Montana as well.
No, you're absolutely right, Patricia. You got to know your audience, and that's the best thing you can do. We had Wyoming. Patricia got me in touch with the right person in Wyoming to talk to about what they were doing, and we had them speak to the committee about that. And that was one of the two proposals that passed. How Wyoming, well, it's a little different, but it's the same concept anyway. I think there's a lot of comfort for Montana legislators knowing that Wyoming's out there first. And so if you can find those connections for your decision makers, it's going to really pave the way.
Okay, I'm going to post the last question in the chat as well. The question is, what policies, procedures, or practices do you think will be a valuable addition to your employer regarding students in special populations experiencing homelessness? I know this is a really large question that can kind of get to maybe even like the mission of like your team or your office, but just like in brainstorming and thinking about your ideal situation, what are some of these policies, procedures, or practices that you think could be included at your place of work that could positively benefit students experiencing homelessness in general, and also those who fall into what we're calling special populations?
I don't mind breaking the ice with kind of a self-criticism, I guess. I think in a lot of my policy and advocacy work, I've been very focused on children and youth experiencing homelessness because that's the mission of our organization and what I know the most about. But I think as we have been delving more into issues that affect so many different populations, and there's so much intersectionality, of course, with youth experiencing homelessness who also are more likely to be students of color. They're also more likely to be LGBTQ plus students. And so trying to build those alliances with other advocates who may not know anything about homelessness, that might not be at all what they do, but they might work with communities of color or queer communities, or foster care is kind of an obvious overlap that I think we have done a lot of co-work with over the past few years. But looking at other areas of intersectionality and building those alliances and working together to pass a policy that's going to be good for all of our clients or our constituents, and being a little bit more open-minded about that. And deliberate about that.
One dangerous thing to avoid, and that I think is really important when dealing with data, especially for this population, is a lot of times legislators will look at this data and go, oh, it's just because those kids want to be homeless. They're bad kids. That's why they're out there. Like, having those conversations with youth and providers to be able to explain why that is not the case is so important, and to be prepared to head that off at the pass, because inevitably you will have somebody say, oh, they're skipping class because they're just bad kids. And it's like, no, that's not what's happening. And here's the reasons why, to talk about the underlying numbers, especially when you're dealing with disproportionality, you can have that happen as well.
I saw Lorinda raise her hand. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was in addition to that, and I think I put something kind of similar to the chat. So we're the adults in the room with some level of influence. And I know for me in the state of Nevada, and Patricia knows my shtick, I try to involve my intern every freaking time, right? At the most basic level, adults get the numbers, and adults will treat other adults different ways. But if we can coach our babies and support them to how to deflect and be there and walk them through it, they're the best advocates, I would say. And again, I know it's not a simple process, but until it becomes personal and an adult has to say to another young person or someone in college or going through high school why this is not happening, I think, at least for me, I'm big on shaming adults into, I want to understand why not, because it's somebody else's child. And I think to the example that Ms. Stockwell provided about the legislator, until it became personal, it was those kids, those people, right? So I just, again, I'll get off my box, but I just like to remind us when we have proximity to young babies, those with potential for leadership, we as the adults have to facilitate that advocacy, that infrastructure, right? We need that help from them the same way they need it from us. And so that's all I would add to what I've heard about data, et cetera, et cetera.
I saw a hand that Lorinda had a hand up. No pressure, Lorinda, if you don't want to chime in, but if you do, I wanted to make sure to make a spot for you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I'd be happy to chime in. I can't speak about like policies or practices that kind of inform like my employer, because I'm just kind of just speaking from like my experience, just as like a youth that kind of experience homelessness, and just from like the discussions today, just something that like immediately struck me is, I think it might have been in Brett's presentation about like funding for like drivers ed education. And it like, I think I just, as soon as I heard that, I like just immediately recalled high school and just like how fundamentally like that was like such a huge barrier. And I just would show up to school like late, like every single day, just because of the fact that there wasn't like stable access to like transportation. So yeah, so I that was just one policy that kind of stood out, but just from like observing and just like as just like a student's participation with like SchoolHouse and kind of just noticing the good practices there, it really is like empowering like the levels of like engagement and like continuous engagement that can be fostered. So yeah, so those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you for sharing, Lorinda, and thank you for sharing, Chris.
I don't see anything else in the chat box right now, Tamara.
Okay, all right. Well, I just want to give a huge thank you, one, for you all attending the session and just contributing. I think SchoolHouse Connection, we're really excited about this being a space for a lot of knowledge sharing and folks being able to grow in the work that they're doing, and for relationships to be developed like across sectors and then also across states and localities. So thank you for being here, and a huge thank you to Jaboa, Lizette, Brett, Gabriella, and Hope for your presentations. This session has been recorded, and I am going to link the PowerPoint presentation in the virtual whiteboard so that folks will be able to access this in the future. Oh, and I think I see Hope's hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to give one caveat to what I said, my first point about be ready when you're asked for an idea to have one. Also, don't wait to be asked. I don't want to give that impression. You do not have to wait to be asked. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in there too.
That's a great point. And I saw a lot of like smiles and nods to that. Okay, well, we are at 3:25, so I am going to end it here, give you all 5 minutes back in your day, and we will see you at our July session, where we're going to be doing a deeper dive into best practices in state policy. So we will see you then. Bye, everyone.